Hi everyone. I'm looking at a source today that gives a different perspective on the location that's connected with the founding of Britain and the first landing of its legendary first king. The name of this king was Brutus of Troy, and the place where he's said to have landed was called Totnes. Brutus had had no connection with Britain before his landing in Totnes, and the land was deserted except for a few giants. Brutus himself was of Trojan origin and had been exiled from his own home in Italy. But this land had been promised to him by the goddess Diana, and his descendants went on to rule the land, thereafter named Britain, for the best part of 2,000 years. The earliest excellent source to mention the place Totnes in relation to this story was the very well-known Historia Regum Britanniae. I recently did another video of this when I visited the modern town of Totnes to see what's known as the Brutus Stone, which folklore would have it was the very spot where Brutus first set foot in the Promised Land. Now, I did express a little bit of doubt as to whether the modern location of the town of Totnes was the actual location intended by the author of the Historia Regum Britanniae. That author is usually identified as Geoffrey of Monmouth, as I'm sure the most would know. Now, the text that I referred to in that video was from what you would call the Vulgate version of the Historia Regum Britanniae. Here's a fuller quote from the Reeve and Wright Critical Edition, published in 2007. So as he made his way to Britain, the text says that Brutus decided to board ship and to sail for the island vouchsafed by him by the divine prophecy. Favourable winds brought him to the promised isle, where he came ashore at Totnes. Okay, so I won't quote the Latin, but the phrase in relation to Totnes reads Totnesio litore, the Totnesian coast, as some would also have translated. Okay, so what I said in my previous video is that the town that we call Totnes is about 11 miles inland. Granted, it does lie on the tidal river Dart, but would this be a good spot for over 300 ships to land? That is what's described in the text of the Historia Regum Britanniae. But there have been other suggestions too. One of the better ones is Dartmouth. So if you look downriver from Totnes, down to the estuary, we find Dartmouth, a place where fleets are known to have gathered in the late Middle Ages, and a plausible location to land in Britain from Gaul, as what is described in the story. It's on the south coast of England, and as I say, known to have a really significant naval heritage. So we have to ask ourselves, what did the name Totnes mean to the author of the Historia Regum Britanniae? Did the author mean the site of the town as it is now, or a larger region as some have supposed, which would open up the possibility of Dartmouth and other places too? Now, in my previous video, I also made reference to an article authored by John Clark in 2016, and in his article, Clark looked at the issue in detail, and he referred to a version of the Historia Regum Britanniae known as the variant. And in the variant, the location alluded to seems to describe Dartmouth better than it does Totnes. Okay, so this is the text of the variant that sort of corresponds to what I quoted from the Vulgate. So it talks about Brutus's first arrival in Britain. So it says, "Then with prosperous winds and the favour of the gods, they sailed for the divinely promised land, and landed in the harbour at the mouth of the river Dart, which is known as Totnes." Now, the original was in Latin, of course. I'm reading the translation. I'll put the Latin on the screen, but I'm no good at pronouncing Latin words, so I won't read it out as such. But the key point of this text is that it explicitly says that the place Totnes is on the mouth of the River Dart, so it seemed to indicate that Dartmouth was intended by the author of the variant to be the location, because the modern town of Totnes is 11 miles upriver. Now, this is well covered by Clark in his article, but what weakened the argument about placing this landing site in Dartmouth rather than Totnes was that the variant was assumed to postdate the Vulgate and to derive from it. So the assumption would be that the Vulgate was the more correct and older text. Remember that the Vulgate just vaguely placed the landing site on the Totnesian coast and didn't explicitly reference the mouth of the River Dart. But Clark's article was written in 2016, which is relatively recently really, but even more recently a new edition of the variant was published by David Birchmore in 2019. It had a translation and a good introduction too, which made it a really accessible edition. And in his introduction, Birchmore made some really interesting suggestions as to the origin of the text, which had particular significance to the matter in question in this video.
The author of the variant isn't named in the prologue or the introduction of the text. The well-known claim that attributed the Historia Regum Britanniae to a translation made by Geoffrey of Monmouth from a very old book in the British tongue is only made in the epilogue, and it seems to have been added much later on. What the author of the variant does say in the prologue is that they were following the history of the ancients.
And the variant doesn't seem to be connected with Geoffrey at all. So Birchmore's suggestion is that the variant, once again that's the version which explicitly mentions the mouth of the River Dart in terms of the location of Brutus's landing site, was actually the source of the Vulgate rather than the other way around. And what Birchmore says in relation to the variant is that on the basis of fundamental differences in vocabulary, syntax, and style, all scholars agree that Geoffrey himself did not write the variant. Birchmore's ultimate conclusion is that the differences in narrative and style between the variant and the Vulgate meant that the variant seems to be an early draft of the Vulgate. So there we go. If we accept this later suggestion by this well-regarded scholar, then it would seem that the earliest surviving story of Brutus landing in Britain explicitly mentions him landing at the mouth of the River Dart. Now, there is a precedent for this Brutus story in a 9th century work called the Historia Britonum. The details of Brutus's landing are not fully explored in that text. It's a lot more vague and just said he landed in Britain. But the earliest text that we have that gives real details on the landing are what's found in this variant version. Okay, hope you all enjoyed that. I'm going to keep it short today. But I've been looking at a lot of these different versions of the Historia Regum Britanniae, a lot of them in the Welsh language too, and I have found that there's a good deal of variation in these stories that I think could have some wider significance. So I'm going to be doing quite a few more videos on this topic. So if you've enjoyed this video, keep an eye out for them.